Okay, now you've had a chance to take a look at the initial presentation, and the thing that we're going to do now is just walk through some hypothetical scores for each of the three categories. Now, what's important here is that even though you're putting your scores on the scoring sheet, you also really want to be keeping in mind the guide to judges scoring that we've already talked about in earlier videos. So we've talked about the various criteria that go into each of these three categories. So when I'm looking at Team 1's presentation and whether it was clear and systematic, you want to be thinking about, right, 10 is absolutely perfect, 9 is outstanding, 8 is, still very, very good, 7 still solid, 6 you're starting to see omissions, weaknesses, etc. Right? So you want to think a little bit about where you fall. Now for myself, I'm going to score the presentation a 7, and I'm going to tell you why. But before I do that, I want to emphasize that you might think that the 7 is a little bit on the low side, or you might think it's generous. And it actually doesn't matter if you're a generous judge or a pretty tough grader, as long as you're a consistent judge. The key is that you're consistent throughout a match. And it doesn't really matter if you tend to be on the lower side of scoring or higher side of scoring, because teams are, it's always about the margin of victory between teams rather than a total accumulation of points throughout the day. So it's sort of an important thing to keep in mind, so you don't have to worry about that too much as a judge. So why a 7 for me? So for me, I was impressed with a lot of this presentation from a clarity and organization point of view, and really struggled between a 7 and an 8. I thought Skylar started off really well by sort of laying out a basic map of all of their roles and the various things people were going to talk about. I thought I was able to follow Izzy's discussion well in terms of the two main principles that she was looking at, non-maleficence, and also she didn't name it, a sort of retributivist principle of the idea that you have more obligations when you cause a problem. I thought Avery outlined pretty clearly 3 different kinds of harms that came, and Jacob had articulated the two main objections. So to me, the reason I went down from an 8 to a 7 was really 2 things. And you're going to see this a little bit in the ethical analysis portion too. For me, what I noticed about the team is that the question is about moral issues that consumer culture gave rise to. And very quickly, the conversation sort of became about the ills of the garment industry, and it seemed like it was predominantly a discussion of sweatshops. So to some extent, that's an ethical analysis issue, but to another degree, it is an organizational issue, because it sort of begins to sort of lose the thread of the initial question. Now that can be hard, of course, for teams, because questions can be a bit of a curveball, especially if you've been preparing a case specifically about the fast fashion industry and garments. The other thing is, I felt like the organizational elements were much stronger in the beginning part of the presentation than at the very end. At the very end, I found it a little harder to follow some of the objections, a little harder to follow the summary wrapping up. But again, somewhere in that 6 to 9 range is perfectly reasonable. To me, 7 or 8 are probably right in the ballpark for that presentation. So now let's take a look at the coverage of the ethical dimensions of the case. So again, I thought the team did a solid job. The team talked about various harms that come from this kind of sweatshop condition, fast fashion industry. Avery outlined 3 different kinds of harms, and like I said, Izzy outlined a couple of principles. So there was a pretty good fleshing out of things. What seemed to be missing was a discussion of the consumer end of consumer culture. So it seemed like the question was about consumer culture and the culture of desiring to spend money on material goods. and the way that that gets amplified with the high turnover of goods, such as in fast fashion. So when you don't discuss that wider issue as part of this, I felt like some of that becomes a little bit lacking. The other thing I noticed a little bit in the ethical analysis is that it seemed like some of the analysis seemed to rest on what might be a little bit of a false dilemma, that it seemed like the team was arguing that consumers really had two choices. They had to purchase clothes that were durable but utterly unaffordable, or they would be engaging in the fast fashion industry. But it seems to me that that is a little bit of a false dichotomy, that there is more consumer choice than that. And so this idea that it was sort of a forced situation seemed to me to be something that I'd probably want to push back on a little bit if I was a judge or an opposing team. So for those two reasons, I gave them a 7 for the ethical analysis. So now we go on to the consideration of multiple viewpoints. And to me, I gave them a 6 here, and it's only because for me the difference between 7s and below is that I'm starting to notice omissions when I give a team a 6 or lower. And I appreciated that Jacob talked about two main objections. One, that it's hard to extricate yourself from consumer culture, and two, that it benefits consumers. But I was surprised that the case itself had a whole paragraph about benefits to retailers, manufacturers, and consumers, and there was not really any mention of benefits to the retailers or the manufacturers. So to me, that seemed like something that was an omission, and one that you didn't have to necessarily dig too far to see. So I was fairly punitive. Again, those are probably pretty tough scores, and if you would have given the team higher scores, as long as you're consistent, that's 100% fine. And just to make sure we're keeping track of the score sheet itself, it's really important that you make sure you're filling out as you go. And you'll notice that this spot over here on the right is blank, and that's because you're obviously waiting before you're giving a score for the Team 2's initial presentation. And the next score you'll give is right here. That's for Team 2's commentary. So we'll come back. Go ahead now, take a listen to Team 2's commentary, and we'll come back in a separate video and we'll discuss that as well as the initial team's response to commentary. So we'll do the next two parts of the match in one video. Thanks.